I'm here with one of the most influential men in modern wrestling today, Eric Bischoff. Eric, how are you doing today?
I'm doing very well. Great to be with you. Thanks for the invite.
Thanks for coming on. You were just at Raw 25 a couple of weeks ago. I wanted to ask, how did that go?
Well, from my perspective, it went really, really well. I had a blast. I got to, spend a little time in New York City, which I always enjoy. Living in Cody, Wyoming, as much as I love Wyoming and love living here, it's always nice to be able to get into New York and just look for a good deli or a little bit of great sushi and just hang out. But more importantly, I got to see some, friends I haven't seen in a long time and people that I used to work with, step out in front of a crowd of 15 or 18,000 people in Barclays Center and be a part of a very monumental television event. And for that, I'm very grateful.
It definitely is a monumental television event. I did want to ask you, though, is it odd to be kind of introduced as a former GM, kind of just considering maybe not the direct contributions to the show, but all the indirect contributions you had on the show, considering, it was a 1 hour taped show with a lot of cartoonish characters back in the day, and you kind of changed it to where it kind of looks the way it does today.
No, it wasn't weird for me at all. I mean, I was like everybody else on that show that was brought back. I was a character. I wasn't brought back as, an executive or certainly not an executive from another television company. I was brought in, because I represented a character on the Monday Night Raw show, and I think that's very appropriate. And it didn't cross my mind that I should think or feel differently.
Yeah. Did you get to talk with Vince McMahon at all?
No, I didn't. We were able to say hello briefly, very briefly. But look, there's a lot going on. On a live broadcast, and particularly that live broadcast being, what it was. And, there were a lot of changes that took place that were out of people's control, and everybody had to adjust. And, it's the nature of live television. So I certainly didn't go there expecting to break bread and catch up with Vince McMahon or anybody else that was working on the show, to be honest with you.
Yeah. When you're out there and you're in front of that live crowd, does it give you the itch to kind of get back and doing something in the wrestling realm?
No doubt. Look, there's a lot of things I don't miss about, being in the industry. And at the top of that list would be travel. That's definitely something I've kind of gotten. The less I do it, the less I want to do it. But I do miss, I miss two things. I would say, first and foremost, I miss the creative process, which includes not only creating storylines and trying to develop characters and, the obvious, but I really miss directing and producing talent. That's fun for me. It's fun, especially younger talent or talent that is considered kind of middle-of-the-road talent that hasn't quite broken through yet. When it comes to, interviews and their character and communicating with the audience, I love that. And I do love the reaction from the crowd, whether it's a good reaction or a positive reaction like I received at, on Monday Night Raw, or if it's, my ability to create heat, because that's how I've made my money. So the largest portion of my career as a character is pissing people off, and I miss that.
Yeah. Now, I know you were involved. You have some legal stuff with TNA. You can't really talk much about that. Is that correct? Is that still the case?
It depends what the question is.
Gotcha.
I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about TNA because since no one spends a lot of time watching Impact, which used to be TNA, I don't really want to devote a lot of time talking about it.
All right. Well, my question is, when you went back and when you went there with Hulk, TNA, they hit 2 million viewers several times. Their ratings kind of reached all-time highs. They were doing house shows that were, doing in excess of 5,000 people. It seemed like that was the closest since the end of WCW that we saw there being a real number 2 promotion. Do you think I will see something like that again?
Well, do I ever see? First of all, were we a legitimate number two? There's an old saying, numbers lie and liars use numbers. I guess in one sense, you could suggest that at that period of time, TNA could have been considered by some to be number two, but the difference between number one and number two was the equivalent of the distance between number one and number 222. Mm-hmm. We may have been number two, but number one wasn't even on the horizon.
Right.
Now, that being said, do I see another wrestling company ever achieving the level of success that TNA had at that particular time? I don't think so. I think for a variety of reasons. One being that just the television industry, the entertainment industry in general, has changed so dramatically over the last 7 years, mm-hmm. with the growth and the evolution of digital and streaming platforms, the accessibility of so many different types of content from around the world, and the emergence of a lot of independent wrestling, quality independent wrestling, I might add, that now exists on some of those platforms. I think all of that, while great on one hand and exciting on one hand, makes it very difficult for someone to put together a promotion and a brand and an initiative that would find its way to a major cable network like Spike was at that time, which is now Paramount TV Network. Mm-hmm. I think without that high-profile cable television platform, it would be virtually impossible to compete anymore at that level.
Mm-hmm. Now, one of the things you were able to do when you took WCW from where it was to its all-time heights was you were able to create a product that was very different from WWE. It looked different. The storylines were different. It was more adult-oriented. With a company like a TNA still right now, do you think there's too much sameness to just almost being another WWE brand as opposed to finding its own niche?
Look, at the risk of sounding cynical or derisive, mm-hmm. which I don't mean to be or to do, there's nobody at Impact Wrestling or Anthem Sports that has the vision, the knowledge, the experience, or the ability to see an opportunity that would allow them to create a brand and a product that would be different enough mm-hmm. to grow an audience and catch the audience's imagination while simultaneously, and this is the art within the art, not turning off the existing fan base. So the art is, the sports entertainment, professional wrestling, audience, whatever you want to call it, is a massive audience. Arguably 25 million plus, fans around the world. That's mm-hmm. a great thing. The difficulty is how do you appeal to them, but at the same time present something that's different enough to capture their imagination without alienating what they love, if that makes sense.
Right.
And that takes a unique talent and vision, and more importantly, a real understanding of not only the wrestling business. There are people there at Anthem who have spent a cup of coffee in a small closet, called the wrestling business in their own little world. And again, I know that sounds derisive, but I'm trying to paint a picture here. Mm-hmm. The people that are involved in it have never played on a large stage, have never dealt with major networks, have never faced the challenge of appealing to a large audience. None of them have ever really dealt in the business of the wrestling business on a major scale. So it's impossible for them to have the experience and the knowledge because they've never done it. They've never been exposed to it. Likely they've never even been in a room where it's been discussed. They probably haven't even had the luxury of bringing coffee to a room full of executives and overhear the business of the business being discussed. So as derisive, as that sounds, and negative as that sounds, what I'm really trying to say is there's nobody there that has the background and the experience to see that opportunity. So is it likely that it'll happen? Maybe, sometime in the next, 500,000 years, but not anytime in our future.
Yeah. Now, one promotion that, it's a cult following, but it is getting more and more popular is New Japan, a company you work with a lot in the past. I've criticized them on my podcast because I feel like the iron's hot right now and they're not striking quite hard enough in the U.S. as far as they have an upcoming show in Long Beach. They booked one date. It sold out in 20 minutes. You had mentioned on Twitter that you were watching it last October. Have you been keeping up with them much at all?
I do. I don't follow them religiously. I definitely have my eye on them. I think they're doing a lot of things right. And look, there's two ways of looking at it. I'm gonna go back to your point about not striking while the iron is hot. I don't know any of the current management at New Japan Pro Wrestling. When I was doing a lot of my business with New Japan Pro Wrestling, it was Mr. Baisho, who has since passed away, who was kind of the business guy. Was one of the top executives there. Obviously, Antonio Inoki was somebody that I did a lot of business with. Masa Saito was somebody that I worked with very closely. There were a number of people within the office, the executives, that I worked with very, very closely, who are no longer there. So I'm not, even though I used to work with the company in New Japan, I don't have a long history with any of the people that are currently there. That being said, I like what they're doing now. And, there's a saying in show business, always leave them wanting more. Mm-hmm. I would much rather see New Japan come in, have a huge hit, have the buzz in the industry that they sold out in 20 minutes, and then not come back again for a while, because that creates a desire. That makes the audience want to see more, as opposed to coming in and announcing a 26-city tour and starting off hot and fizzling out after 6 or 8 nights. Mm-hmm. The only thing that the audience will remember is that it was not that successful. But if they slowly build that audience and they slowly build that following by picking and choosing their markets and picking and choosing their events and having incredible sellouts and critical reviews as a result of their shows, I think that slow build will work for them. It won't work overnight, but most things don't.
Yeah, absolutely. I did want to kind of go back to WCW real quick. What you had mentioned earlier when about certain websites and stuff misinterpreting certain contributions. I feel like that way about Kevin Nash a lot. Like, people bring up him not drawing during a period where no one drew in WWF, and he was one of the key figures responsible for the hottest era that we've seen. Along with yourself, Scott Hall, Hulk Hogan, your team that you had in place. How different do you, and this is impossible to answer, but still, how different do you think wrestling would be today if Kevin Nash and Scott Hall had stayed with WWF in 1996 and not signed over?
That's a really good question. It's kind of a theoretical one, and I normally would shy away from those and, possibly not even answer it. But this is one this is one though that I'd like to attack here, because it is a really good question, and the way I'm interpreting that question to a degree is what would have happened if there never would have been an NWO. Mm-hmm. Because in truth, had Scott and Kevin not made their way over to WCW, I don't think I would have pulled the trigger on the NWO storyline. I had the idea, the framework of the idea, I had in my head for quite some time. And despite what people think they know or what people have read based on what other people who think they know have said, I didn't rip the idea off from anybody in New Japan. There was no version of the NWO that existed before I launched it here in the United States. I didn't copy anything that I saw while I was doing business in Japan. But what I did do and what I did learn in Japan was the psychology behind reality-based storylines. And I studied closely for a year or 18 months the difference between the way the product in the United States was promoted at every level and the way it was promoted at every level in Japan. And I noticed the difference, the way it that difference in promotion manifested itself in the way the audience perceived it, the product, and the way the local media supported the product. I would go over to Japan and be a part of the big New Year's Eve show and on a Saturday night, for example, and on Sunday morning it was the headlines in the Tokyo newspaper. And in the United States, you couldn't get anybody to cover a major wrestling event. You probably can now a little bit in the entertainment section of the paper, but at that time, back in the 90s, nobody was covering wrestling in any way, shape, or form. You almost had a hard time buying coverage for wrestling outside of the wrestling magazines. So I studied that phenomenon pretty closely, and coming away from that experience that I had in Japan, I knew that when the opportunity was right, I wanted to create a storyline that had that sense of reality and believability in it so that the media and the audience would respond accordingly. It was more coincidental, quite frankly, than anything, that while the goal or the desire on my part to create a reality-based, kind of believable storyline that would get people talking and get the media to pay attention to it, while that idea was just vaguely bouncing around inside of my skull, Scott Hall and Kevin Nash just happened to become available. And that was the kind of perfect storm, if you will, between two characters who had previously been in WCW before they went to WWF, coming back to WCW after having been made stars so that they could take revenge on the company that didn't treat them right and didn't give them the opportunity that they deserved when they were there the first time. That was the premise of the NWO storyline. And because of just the coincidences and the reality that went along with those coincidences, I was able to kind of manifest the idea that had been brewing in my head for quite some time. Now, if you ask me, what would the wrestling industry be like if none of that had ever happened? I think the wrestling industry wouldn't be close to what it is today. I will say, and I know this sounds like I'm patting myself on the back, but as I like to say, no brag, just fact. If I wouldn't have launched Nitro, if we wouldn't have launched the NWO angle, if we wouldn't have gone live every Monday night and then gone head-to-head with the WWE, if we wouldn't have started the Monday Night Wars, if the Monday Night Wars wouldn't have escalated the viewing audience to the phenomenal degrees that it did, I suggest that we might not see WWE today. Because the WWE, going back to pre-1995, was, it was successful, but I don't think that format as it existed then would have survived through the 90s and certainly not to 2018. And I doubt that anybody would have been able to convince anybody in WWE to change that format and embrace what became the Attitude Era, which was nothing more than a reflection. I don't want to say a copy, but that's what it was. Mm-hmm. We created the template for that adult-based, edgy, 18 to 34 demo format, and after a year or so of getting their butts kicked, WWE followed suit and did so successfully. And not long after, took the company public. And not long after, it became $1 billion market cap company. And not long after, launched their own network. And I think all of those things can arguably, not definitively, not not simply because of the NWO and what started with Scott Hall and Kevin Nash, but all of those things combined, I think, were the things that helped propel WWE to the point it is today.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, speaking personally, I was a big fan of the 80s, and I was just falling out of touch with wrestling around 93, 94. It just wasn't holding my interest. And then I became the Monday Night Wars just made me a mega fan again, and who knows what I would be doing if it weren't for that period. I mean, if you go back, on the WWE network, which I love the network for a variety of reasons, mostly because Nitro still exists there, and people who were not even born yet or were too young to remember can go back and see what a great show that really was in some respects. But I've done a couple things on the WWE network. Once or twice a year, I'll go back and do something there. One of the first things I did, and I think one of the best things I did there, was the very first Legends with JBL about a year and a half or 2 years ago. And I don't know if you saw it or not, but I did.
On that episode of Legends with JBL that I did, JBL opened up that show basically, by saying everything that I just said, more eloquently and much more succinctly. But he basically said if it wasn't for the NWO and Monday Night Wars, there would have been no Attitude Era. There would have been no Stone Cold Steve Austin. There would have, been no live, Monday Night Raw. There would have been no reality-based wrestling characters, and there probably wouldn't have been a Mr. McMahon, which came along about a year after Eric Bischoff became, the heel president of the company. So, in JBL's own words, I think there's some truth to the fact that, NWO, certainly starting with Kevin and Scott, Nitro, all of it had a lot to do with what we're seeing today. And people like yourself and others who are still making a living, whether directly in the wrestling business or in the ancillary revenue opportunities and jobs that exist there, like yours, we all still exist. I'm doing this interview because of it, so I'm grateful.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the big things you guys did that I feel like doesn't get it's not remembered as much, but it was a huge success, was that pay-per-view where we had Dennis Rodman and Karl Malone. It got mentioned during the Final Fours. It got just a ton of publicity, and it's still remembered for sure, but I think when people think celebrity involvement, they always go to Tyson. But that was brilliantly done, and it got a lot of people talking, and it was a big success at the time. How hard was that to put together? And with Ronda Rousey now coming into WWE, if you had to kind of put your Booker hat back on, what would you, where would you kind of go with that, with booking Rousey?
Well, let's kind of hard to talk about Ronda Rousey and Karl Malone and Dennis Rodman.
Yeah, it was all over the place. Sorry about that.
I'm not, we'll just kind of take them one at a time.
Yeah.
You asked me how tough was it to put together, Rodman and Malone. It really wasn't that tough. I remember getting a phone call from Hulk Hogan saying that, he got word through whatever contact he had that Dennis Rodman was, thinking about trying to get into wrestling and may have even had a conversation with the WWF at that time. And Hulk had his phone number and said, hey, why don't you give him a shout and see if we can put something together. I called, actually Dennis Rodman, I didn't talk to Dennis directly. I talked to his manager or agent at the time, a guy by the name of Dwight Manley, who was Rodman's agent. And I think Dennis was much more excited about working with Hulk Hogan than he was, probably working with anybody at WWE, because Hulk is Hulk. And it was pretty easy for me to put together the deal with Dennis Rodman through Dwight Manley, who coincidentally also managed Karl Malone. So, Diamond Dallas Page had developed a little bit of a relationship with Karl Malone. I already had a relationship through Dennis Rodman with Dwight Manley. So putting that one together was not that difficult at all. And what made it work so phenomenally, remember, there are a lot of things that made it work. Let's just start with the timing. we've got the Bulls and the Jazz in the playoffs. And at the peak of, NBA awareness and viewership, I'm promoting a wrestling event with two of the key players on both teams.
Right.
That happens, once every 100 years. So the timing was fortuitous. The relationships, as a result of, everybody's work and efforts was great and made it easier. The guys, Dennis Rodman was, and he wasn't a reluctant celebrity. Some guys get into it. They're not really sure they want to do it, or they're insecure about it. And as a result of being insecure, they become very hesitant and kind of hold back. Dennis wasn't that guy. Dennis embraced it. And so did Karl Malone, by the way. Mm. So much so that I was able to convince Karl Malone and Dennis Rodman to have a little altercations and dust-ups, kind of off the court, once the play stopped and it didn't involve the game, there was enough, trash talking between the two of them that we were able to kind of encourage. I don't want to say orchestrate because that might get people in trouble, but we were able to encourage it so that we could take advantage of it. Mm. And that, like I said, that probably will never happen again for a lot of reasons. Yeah. Now, Ronda Rousey, that's going to be interesting for me to watch. When we talk about, you say put your Booker hat on or your creative hat, mm-hmm. for those that aren't sure what that means, what Booker hat means. Look, I said when Ronda lost her last fight, and she didn't just lose her fight, she got her ass handed to her, mm-hmm. badly. As she did the fight before that. So her last two fights, I'm looking for the word.
Mystique?
The mystique, that's a great word. The mystique of Ronda Rousey was shattered, not once, but twice. Mm-hmm. And that matters. But I don't think that's what mattered the most. What I think mattered the most was the way Ronda handled it. Mm-hmm. In the press, the way the public reacted to her, the way she reacted to the public. It was real sour grapes on her part. She was bitter, and she didn't handle those losses with the kind of grace that could have endeared her to the audience. She could have been a bigger star and a bigger babyface as a result of those losses than she would have been possibly had she won them.
Right.
But rather than seizing that opportunity and seeing that opportunity for what it was in that moment and being a gracious loser and acknowledging that she got beat because she got beat by a better athlete on that particular night, doing that would have made her, she would have gotten more over as a result of that in some ways than she was, beating people up as she had been doing prior to that. So when she crapped all over the media, when she crapped all over fans by refusing to do interviews and just being bitter, mm-hmm. it turned the audience against her, but not in a way that you can build upon. There's a way of getting heat that works for you, and there's a way of getting heat that works against you. And the heat that she created for herself was the latter. And when after that all went down about 15 months ago, and everybody started speculating about Ronda Rousey going to the WWE, I came out and said I just think it would be a bad idea because of all the things that we just discussed, that I did. She didn't handle her losses well. The mystique was gone. What is the WWE going to do? Bring her in and have her wipe out half the women's division because she's the baddest woman on the planet? That won't work. Are they going to put her over, as a babyface? Good luck with that. Right. So there's some real creative character challenges there. Now, I think, there are people in WWE that are up to that challenge. There's no doubt about it. You know, they've created some great stars. And I think given the time and the patience and acknowledging, you know, where Ronda has been for the last 16, 18 months of her life, and figuring out how to create that character and that storyline, you know, in full acknowledgement of that history, I think there's a way to do it. But they're going to have to be careful. And here's the biggest challenge. And first of all, I don't know Ronda Rousey, but I think she's charismatic as hell when she wants to be. She's obviously very camera friendly. She's obviously a great athlete. She obviously knows how to train. She knows how to sacrifice. She understands discipline. She has all of the tools that come in the toolbox of a professional athlete, and that's great. She's starting out way ahead of the game in that respect. But how is she going to be able to handle becoming a performer in a scripted environment? And how is she going to learn and understand and adapt to the challenges of telling a story using physical drama instead of going in and competing physically? Because they're two different worlds. You know, professional wrestling, sports entertainment, whatever you want to call it, is no different than a Broadway play. Except in a Broadway play, actors are using dialogue to tell a story and establish their characters. In WWE, they're using a physical dialogue to tell their story and build their characters. And those are, that's a very unique art. It really is. And how quickly will Ronda adapt to that art? That remains to be seen. I wish her the best. I mean, she's a beautiful young woman. She's obviously talented. She's an athlete. You know, I really wish her the best. But I think if you go back and look at the last 16 months of her history, or 18 months of her history, and the baggage that she's bringing with her, along with the notoriety, by the way, that she got. It was great notoriety. Everybody knows her name. But there's some baggage there, too.
Yeah.
And how that is all kind of, you know, thrown into the big stew pot, and how it's all cooked and what other ingredients they add to it, you know, so that we can see how she comes out of that. You know, I'm very excited to see how that evolves.
Also, you're going to be reuniting with Kevin Nash and Scott Hall this weekend at Astronomicon. Is that correct?
Yeah, Astronomicon. The cool part is, you know, Kevin's a Detroit guy. I'm a Detroit guy. So, yeah, we both get to go back to Motown, hang out, and see some wrestling fans and talk about the old days and talk about growing up in Detroit and all kinds of good stuff.
Nice. That'll take place this weekend, Sterling Heights, Michigan. And I also wanted to ask you, we were talking about Ted Turner and everything. Is he someone you've kept in touch with at all after WCW folded or was sold?
I did. I did for a while after WCW folded, a couple of years. And when I say, you know, I did, I mean, it wasn't like, you know, we chatted on the phone twice a week or anything like that. But I was able to stay in touch with him a little bit. And he actually did me a really huge favor a couple of years after all that went down. I was putting together a deal for Fox Television with Jeff Gordon. And I went in to pitch the idea to Jeff Gordon initially when it first started. And I sat down with Jeff's dad, his stepfather. I sat down with Jeff's dad, who was handling all of Jeff Gordon's business back then. And I'm laying this all out there, and I'm giving him all the ideas I had and, you know, walking him through the PowerPoint. And his dad looked at me and said, well, how do I know you're who you say you are? Which I didn't know how to respond to that because Jeff Gordon's dad wasn't a wrestling fan. So I said, gee, well, you know, I guess I could pull up some stuff on the internet and prove it. He goes, no, I want you to have Ted Turner call me. So, well, okay. That's kind of a big ask. I mean, I know you're Jeff Gordon's dad and all, but Ted Turner is kind of Ted Turner, and you know, I don't have that great of a relationship with Ted. So I got my car, and I thought about it, and I thought, well, what the hell? It doesn't hurt to ask. So I reached out to Ted and let him know what my situation was. And while Ted didn't get on the phone, he did send a very, very nice email over to Jeff Gordon's dad, which helped me close that deal. So that was probably one of the last times, other than thanking Ted for that I've been in touch with him. Ted's kind of out of the limelight now. Mm-hmm. He's putting all of his time and energy into his, charitable endeavors. And, he's getting older. He's just loving life, up in Montana, down in New Mexico. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you again. I'm going to go. Did you have anything else you'd like to plug?
Well, I'm going to do a live Periscope on Twitter where I'm taking questions from fans. So if you want to plug that in any way you can, it's at eBischoff on Twitter. And we'll be doing a live Periscope starting at 8 o'clock Eastern on Wednesday night, the 7th of February. And hope to hear from as many fans as possible. You can send your questions. Send them directly to me on Twitter at eBischoff. And I'll spend as much time answering as many questions as I can.